All right, let's talk Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers, of course, like the rest of the National Football League, in the middle of the scouting combine, evaluating this upcoming class of rookies. But based on some news that's broke over the past 24 hours, the Steelers planning a massive trade. We'll get to the latest there in just 1 second. But first, I'm Nick, and this is Saturday Morning Inspection. One of the things we've noticed about the Pittsburgh Steelers over the course of this offseason, and honestly, it goes back to last offseason as well, is that Omar Khan's being much more of a wheeler dealer. We saw it with the Pickens and Metcalf deals and things like that. He's been a guy that's not afraid to shake things up a little bit. I think he feels correctly like a shakeup is needed when it comes to the Steelers franchise, when it comes to this personnel. The coaching staff obviously changed hands drastically. Mike Tomlin out, he stepped down. Mike McCarthy in, different coaching staff, expanded coaching staff. Change is definitely here when it comes to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And to that end, it looks like bigger changes may be coming at a position of need for Pittsburgh. Let's pull up this report right here, and then we'll get into the details on the other side. This is courtesy of Andrew Filipponi. Source: the Steelers have been in talks with the Jaguars about wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. Also, the two teams discussed the deal at last year's trade deadline. Thomas is going into his third year and saw a big drop-off in his production last year. We'll get into his numbers in just a second. He is a physically talented wide receiver for sure. He's an explosive playmaker, had a great rookie season, a little bit of a drop-off last season, but that may just be a change in offensive coordinator, change in staff. That can happen. The wide receivers obviously trying to integrate themselves into a new strategy, a new scheme. He's still a big-time playmaker and still showcased his talent on numerous occasions for the Jacksonville Jaguars, which, by the way, had a pretty nice regular season, won 13 games, disappointing playoff exit, but it was a good Jaguars offense for the vast majority of the 2025 campaign. I don't think this is just, smoke from the combine. I think this is, honest to goodness, an attack plan by the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I think this is part of the addition of Mike McCarthy. We've talked about this a lot. The Steelers like Will Howard. You can watch one of our videos. Our latest video dives into that specifically, but they know they need to surround him with weapons. They look at this football team and say, DK Metcalf, he's good, right? But the rest of the receivers, a lot of number threes, a lot of number fours, a lot of role players. They need a star. They need a young playmaker, and Brian Thomas Jr. fits that to a T. I think if you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers in their current situation and offensive talent, they're totally lack thereof when it comes to talent. Defensively, they got some guys. Granted, some of them are getting older, but the offensive firepower, it just isn't there, folks. And you guys understand that. You guys know it. You guys watch the games. You guys look at the roster, and I'm not trying to be too critical, but I think one of the reasons you bring in Mike McCarthy, bring in an outside influence, a guy who's been on really good offensive teams, and he's led those offensive teams, is that he knows what a good offense looks like talent-wise. He saw that in Dallas, right? CeeDee Lamb. They had Amari Cooper for a stretch. They had Michael Gallup, had good tight ends, good running backs, Tony Pollard, Ezekiel Elliott. At one point in time, they had 2 Hall of Famers on the offensive line and 2 first-round picks starting. So Mike McCarthy was coming from a franchise, and of course the Packers were stacked when he was there for the vast majority of time as well when it comes to elite talent at the skill positions and the O-line. So he's come from organizations that have invested heavily in offense. And I don't think you hire Mike McCarthy as your head coach and just say, all right, Mike, listen, we know you came from Green Bay and Dallas, and they throw money on the offensive side of the football like there's no tomorrow, but we don't really do that here. So we're hoping you do something you've never done in your 20-plus year career as a head coach, win without a lot of offensive talent, right? I'm sure you'll figure it out. Of course not. That's not what happened at all. You bring in Mike McCarthy to surround him with offensive talent. So again, you can effectively evaluate Will Howard and see what you need to do at the quarterback position going forward. And I think that's why this trade makes a lot of sense. I think from the Jaguars' perspective, they're trying to figure out what to do with Brian Thomas Jr. They almost feel like this is a sell high opportunity, even though he had a down year. It feels like the Jaguars could be potentially trying to acquire more draft picks. They're a team that kind of got the benefit of a favorable schedule. They had been a disappointing team for so long. They had a lot of draft capital, but they look at their team, they look at their wide receiver room, they look at Travis Hunter, going to be their probably big-time, long-term young wide receiver. They probably see Brian Thomas Jr. as expendable, and they need some assets to fill out the rest of their roster. I think it makes sense from both perspectives, and I think there's a lot of smoke here, and I think the Steelers are actually closer to a lot of people than a lot of people realize to making this kind of trade. I want to talk about the numbers from Brian Thomas because I think that's really important. Because he, again, has only played 2 years in the National Football League. And you can see his rookie season, 2024, on the screen right here. This is all courtesy of ESPN. He had 87 catches on 133 targets for 1,300 yards just about, averaging 14.7 yards per catch. That's pretty good with 10 touchdowns and a long of 85, 53 first downs. So, 53 out of 87? We'll call it 5/8, roughly 55% of his catches went for first downs. That's pretty significant. Let's fast forward to 2025. Different story. 48 catches on 91 targets for 700 yards. His average is still exactly the same. So again, we're not seeing a drop off in explosiveness or anything like that. As long as only 46, only had 2 touchdowns. That's disappointing. First downs 33. He actually had a higher percentage of his catches this time around this past season, more than 2/3, about 68% that went for first downs than his rookie season. So why did his numbers drop off? I'll tell you what, the answer is similar, or simple, excuse me. Offensive coordinator change, they stopped feeding him the football. Right? In his rookie year, they would throw quick hitches, quick slants, bubble screens to Thomas all day long. And so he'd have a game where he'd have 3 catches for 60 yards on deep routes and then catch 5 more passes for 40 yards on bubble screens. And he'd end the game with, 7 catches for, 100 yards. And he'd get a big game, a lot of numbers. This past season, he just got those 3 catches for 60 yards. He didn't get the bubble screens. He didn't get the quick hitches or anything like that. Now, I'm not saying the Pittsburgh Steelers will give him those quick hitches, but I think that's the obvious explanation to the drop-off in production. As a vertical threat, as an intermediate threat, as a yards after catch guy, as a first down machine, a playmaker, that hasn't changed at all. Right? Because again, you'll notice here the percentage, like I already hit on, the first down percentage of his receptions still was extremely high and actually went up. That's because they stopped throwing to him short of the sticks on, again, those bubble screens and those smoke screens and things like that to the wide receiver. Again, Brian Thomas Jr. is still a very physically gifted player. He's still a good football player. Sometimes what happens is we look at stats, especially with a team like Jacksonville, which, no offense to the Jaguars, smaller market team, not on TV a bunch, don't get a lot of attention. And you look at a receiver's numbers and you go, yikes, those aren't great numbers. Well, if he isn't getting the targets, if he isn't getting the opportunities, then maybe he's not going to put up the big numbers, right? Sometimes it's about being the right fit in the offense and getting the chance. And there are some players that don't put up a ton of catches and can have a massive impact. I think Brian Thomas Jr. can be that for the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. And I think when you look at Mike McCarthy, he is salivating over the duo of DK Metcalf and Brian Thomas Jr. I think there's a really good chance of this happening. And with that in mind, let's pull up what a potential trade would look like using the PFF mock draft simulator. They also allow you to mock trades. And I love using the PFF tool, Pro Football Focus, for any of you who aren't familiar, because they just use raw analytics. They use numbers, production, age, contract, draft capital, draft value, all of that, right? They factor just numbers in. They take the emotion out of it. Obviously, when it comes time to make the trade, there's going to be emotional elements, human element, of course, on both sides of the table. But I love PFF's sort of mock trade simulator that we're going to highlight here because it at least gives you a frame of reference of what a potential trade could look like just from a raw analytical perspective, just to give us a context, kind of anchor what would go into the trade. And so a trade that was accepted between the Jaguars and the Steelers involved the Pittsburgh Steelers sending their 2nd round pick to Jacksonville. That's not nothing, I will admit that, for Brian Thomas Jr. and pick 124 from the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Jaguars' 4th round pick. So basically the Steelers would lose their 2nd, get Brian Thomas and a 4th round pick. Now, I think it's a better trade than people realize because I think the context matters. So if you look at the wide receiver position last year, let's talk about Pickens and Thomas, because basically Thomas would be a replacement for George Pickens, like ostensibly when you look at the kind of role and kind of mentality they would have with them. So what the Pittsburgh Steelers would do is they would essentially trade George Pickens and a 2nd round pick. So they got rid of George Pickens last year, traded him to Dallas, trade a 2nd round pick in this trade, and they would get a 3rd round pick, a 4th round pick in Brian Thomas Jr. So they would get a talented receiver cheaper than George Pickens. They would lose a 2nd round pick and get a 3rd and 4th in return. That's a fair trade. That's a good trade. That's not a bad deal at all. Right? I think Brian Thomas Jr., is he going to be as good as Pickens? Time will tell. I mean, we honestly didn't know how productive Pickens was going to be until he got to Dallas. And again, that's only because he was playing next to CeeDee Lamb, next to or with Dak Prescott in an offense that was featuring him and they ran the ball, a lot of play action shots, things like that. So it was a great fit for George Pickens. I mean, would he have done that with any other team? We honestly don't know. And I think Brian Thomas Jr. working next to DK Metcalf in this Mike McCarthy offense can be incredibly productive, whether it's with a lot of receptions or receiving yards or just converting, big plays and getting those first downs, like I mentioned earlier statistically. I think the Steelers has a bigger chance to get done than people realize. I think the Steelers are close to a massive trade. When you look at the context of this offseason, I think they're clearly trying to change who they are as a franchise. Mike McCarthy expanding the staff. They're taking a different approach. They're not giving Aaron Rodgers as much rope, saying it's going to be different this time around. They're not being, a totally different, a complete 180 degrees, but they're definitely changing course. Instead of going, say, a heading of dead zero true north, they're going 270. They're going west, which I think a changing direction is something you Steelers fans have been looking forward to for a very long time. All right, we got more to cover today, but Pittsburgh fans, I want to hear from you guys first in the comment section below. Would you be okay with the Steelers trading for Brian Thomas Jr.? First of all, let's see if you like a potential deal. We'll get to the compensation in just a second from your perspective, but would you be on board with that deal? If the answer is yes, what would you want to give up in return for Thomas? Is getting Brian Thomas and a 4th-round pick worth losing your second? I personally think that's a fair trade. It's not a steal from the Pittsburgh Steelers perspective. I think it's a fair trade, though, and I think the Steelers, considering their goals and their strategies, it would make a lot of sense for them to do that. But I'm curious what you guys have to say. Let us know in the comment section below. I really want to hear from you guys. But there's some more context here when it comes to this deal that I do want to bring up, and I think it's important to discuss. And this was the report from a few days ago from the JPA football account on X, and they cited Dan Graziano, the ESPN reporter. Report, there has been no indication so far that the Jaguars have any openness to trading away wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. So this is direct conflict. Now, I will say this. The timing of a lot of these stories matters, right? The Cowboys had no interest in trading Micah Parsons until they did, right? Every team has no interest in trading their players until they do. So I think this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. However, I think the Jacksonville Jaguars aren't going to want to give away Brian Thomas Jr. for nothing. It's not going to be a steal. And this is the point I want to really emphasize, is that this is a Jacksonville team that feels like they can get something in return. They want draft capital. And to be totally honest, I said the Steelers got a 4th in return. There's a chance they may not. I think if I'm going to be totally fair, and this is, I think, a question for you Steelers fans out there, is realistically, it's probably a 2nd-round pick for Brian Thomas straight up. And the Steelers maybe have to throw in like a 6 as a sweetener or something like that. I don't think so, but there's a chance in order to get this deal done that may be something they have to do, because Jacksonville, emotionally, the human side, doesn't want to trade Thomas. Now, they're all in on Travis Hunter. They want him to play wide receiver, as we all expected, in terms of certain situations going forward with this team. Obviously, the snap counts and things like that are up in the air when it comes to Jacksonville. There's been rumors and reports of how much they want to use Hunter. I take all of that with a grain of salt as well. I think they're keeping that pretty close to the chest. But Liam Cohen's a guy that I think, listen, he likes Thomas Jr., but he likes him in the context of being the number 2 receiver, of being a physical, intermediate, and deep threat. I think Steelers would be happy to feature him more, and I think it would make sense for both sides to maybe get more in return. I think the Jacksonville Jaguars, that right now they look at their cap situation, trading away a young player on a cheap deal wouldn't necessarily help them. So I think the Steelers would have to make it worth their while. I think Jacksonville very publicly said, listen, if we're not going to make a trade, which is code for make us an offer we can't refuse. So although the PFF mock simulator I came up with seemed very reasonable and fair, I think in reality it may be harder for Pittsburgh to get Brian Thomas Jr. than what PFF thinks strictly from an analytical perspective. All that being said, I think the Steelers should try and make this move, and I think they're close to it. I think it's something that's ongoing right now. That's what the Combine's all about. We've already seen one trade between the Titans and the Jets go through, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Steelers pull this off. And I think they will specifically get a deal done at wide receiver to add some playmakers. I think Brian Thomas Jr. makes the most sense from my perspective. There may be other players that emerge, but I think push come to shove, Mike McCarthy wasn't brought into the fold just to try and make it work with lesser offensive talent. He's had nothing but success as an offensive play caller when he's had talent around him as a coach, when the players are good. I have seen no rationale at all to bring in Mike McCarthy and just saying, we're going to have the same level of mediocre offensive talent. I think you bring in McCarthy, you give him talent similar to what he's used to, and then let him cook. I think that's the plan in Pittsburgh. I think a big deal is coming for the Steelers.